Ideal types. Ideal types has a special meaning in this context. It doesn't mean a really good font for your computer or typeface. It doesn't mean the absolutely ideal type of human being, man, whatever. Not ideal in that sense, perfect. But it's used in the context of how the sociologist Max Weber used it as a device to think with, and in particular to compare different cases. It's extremely difficult if you're doing proper comparison, which involves looking both at what is the same and what is different, to think of a measuring rod or a framework for doing that. For example, if you're trying to compare, as I often am, different civilizations, if I'm trying to compare China, Japan, Europe, the Anglosphere, as I did in a book, how do you do that? Do you take things one by one? And when you do, how do you compare, for example, the family systems in those four places or the religious systems in those four places? And one method which Weber used very successful in his many books on Chinese Judaism and the Protestant ethic and elsewhere, and particularly in his book on cities, was the ideal type. What this involves is setting up a model that is a simplified version of reality. Things down to their essence. You just choose certain characteristics which you think are particularly important, and then creating that into a template or set which is the full version, the ideal type. So in an example in his book on the cities, he said the ideal type or the extreme case of a city, which is found in northwest Europe, is one which has various constituents. It has a wall, it has its own government system, it has its own laws, it has its own market, it has maybe its own culture, and so on. And then he took this as the ideal type of 5 or so characteristics, and he looked across the world to southern Europe, to the Islamic cities of the Middle East, and then across to China and Japan. And he found that a number of them had some of these things. For example, in the Middle East you had a market and some sort of local religious identity and possibly some political staging post. But many of the characteristics were missing, and likewise in China there was a city wall, and it was a place where the mandarins and the government troops resided, but that was it. So it was very far from the ideal type of the Northwest European city. And this device has allowed him to do these comparisons, and it's allowed me to do them as well. So I find it, for example, when I wrote my book on individualism, I took the ideal type of peasantry, what is a peasant, which I took from East European, particularly East European studies of Russian and Polish and other peasants, and then looked at peasants across Europe and particularly in England, and found that according to this ideal type, England didn't have a peasantry of that ideal type at all. Now, this is a very good method. It has, as I now realize, thinking about it much later, one danger, which is that you tend to take as the ideal type your own system. So a lot of Weber's ideal types, and mine, I suspect, start with what I've experienced here. For example, my ideal type of religion is, the word religion is based on Christian, Protestant, monotheistic religion. So it has rituals and it has dogmas and it has beliefs in the afterlife, and it has a single God, and it has ethics. So that's an ideal type of religion for me. And then when I go to look at, say, Taoism or Buddhism, and I find they're not religions in my sense of the word. Now, that's a good way, I find, to stimulate thought. But of course, some of these ideal types should be made from outside. You should start with the ideal type of, say, a language based on Japanese or Chinese language, and then see to what extent our system doesn't have all the features of that ideal type. So it needs to be made broader, but as a method of starting you to think and being able to bring together different world systems, none of which will conform. That's why it's ideal. It's not real. It's hypothetical. But with that, you can look to see to what extent the actual world conforms to your model. And that's, I think, helpful.